So I look at this week's Parsha, and really the beginning of the book of Shemot that we're in, of Exodus, as both a continuation and deeply disjunctive when you compare Genesis and Exodus. The kind of stories are very different. Rav Kook, the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of British Mandate Palestine, said that Genesis, Breshit, is Sefer Brit Avot, the book of the covenant of our ancestors, by which he meant individual matriarchs and patriarchs. And the book of Shemot is Sefer Brit Sinai, is the book of the covenant of Sinai, which is a national story. And it is easy, I think, to imagine, or maybe not so, I'm suggesting that you could do it. I can imagine having just Sefer Shemot and not Breshit. The story of our people that we tell on Pesach is not the story of Genesis, except for Arami Oved Avi. We have a paragraph about an ancestor who was a wandering Aramean. But the entire narrative, in fact, you might even say the entire point of the entire book of Genesis is to get us to Egypt. And so when in our Parsha we have a very strange moment, which when you hear it, if you ask yourself this question, would strike you even more strangely than it probably already does, which is this the same story? You, Moshe, go tell Pharaoh to let my people go, and here's your proof. I'm going to turn your rod into a snake. Think about any story in Breshit, in Genesis, that sounds like that. Now, yes, the first covenant that God creates with Avram is to walk through split animals, right? Brit ben habtarim. But not something that changes into something else. It sounds actually like the transmogrification classes at Hogwarts as opposed to the book of Breshit. So when you look at this story and then how it spells out, it just feels so strange and out of context if you look at Torah as if you've never looked at Torah before. The philosopher Martin Buber said that one of his great delights in life was to extricate Judaism from the rubble of rabbinism. I want to say that again because some of you will laugh quickly and it might need some unpacking for normal people. To extricate Judaism from the rubble of rabbinism. How often when I look at the Torah am I shocked to see what's there because I've been taught layer upon layer of scaffolded interpretations. So much so that many of us believe that Abraham breaking his father's idols is in the Torah, which it's not. Or that the fully developed picture of Miriam the prophetess can be found in the text, which it can't. For all of her majesty, there is scant evidence sometimes for the things we hold most true. So when you look at this part of the Parsha that I'm about to read out loud, just think about what's being said. And then I want to point to you some levels of interpretation, not because we need to adopt them, but because they point in a different direction than perhaps we might expect. When God instructs Moshe and Aaron to go before Pharaoh the very first time and say, set my people free, I'll just read the English. If you'd like to look, you can, obviously. It's chapter 7, verse 8, where I am. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron when Pharaoh speaks to you and says, produce your marvel. Show me what you got. And this, by the way, in Prince of Egypt is where Steve Martin and Martin Short make their appearance. You shall say to Aaron, take your rod and cast it down before Pharaoh. It shall turn into a serpent. Now, part of us as readers, if we've never seen the text before, which obviously I'm suggesting is a practice, not a reality, say to ourselves, huh? What does that have to do with anything? That's how you're going to prove that my people should be free? Okay. So Moses and Aaron came before Pharaoh, did what they were told. Aaron cast down his rod in the presence of Pharaoh and his courtiers. It turned into a serpent. And you know where the story goes. Then Pharaoh, for his part, summoned the wise men and the sorcerers and the Egyptian magicians. In turn, did the same thing. Their rods turned into serpents. And then you have the part that requires a little bit of unpacking. But Aaron's rods swallowed their rods. Notice what each thing's form was before the next step happened. They each had staffs. Aaron threw his staff down. It turned into a serpent. Then they took their staffs, turned it to a serpent. And then what we remember, at least what we're taught to remember, is that the serpent that used to be Aaron's rod swallowed the serpents that used to be the rods of the Egyptian magicians. But in fact, that's not what the text says when you read it carefully. The text says that Aaron's rod swallowed the Egyptian magicians' rods. That leads Rashi and Hasidic commentators to point out that actually the big miracle was that normal things interacted in strange ways. A rod swallowed rods, not the serpents, even though every part of this is crazy. The miracle actually was within the mundane existence of the rods. When you look at the entirety of this parsha, think about the parts of normal bodies that seem not to function in the way that they should. Moshe brings a language of liberation, of redemption to the people. And what does the text say? Velo shamu oto. They couldn't hear him. Why? Mikotzer ruach umeavodah kasha. Kotzer ruach literally means they couldn't breathe. Short breath. After generations of enslavement, their lungs didn't work anymore. Think about Pharaoh's heart through the 7 plagues of this week's Parsha, the first 5 of which he hardens his own heart, and then God reinforces it, which is a conversation about free will and tshuva that we should have. How to hold people accountability when they aren't the ones making the choices. It's a different drash, but really important. How much agency do human beings in the Torah have? Or is this all God setting up a scene for miraculous deliverance? By the way, that's what it is. But for now, focusing on Pharaoh's heart not working the way a heart is supposed to, the Israelites' lungs not working in the way lungs are supposed to, rods doing strange things, which is not an organ but another thing. Over and over in our parsha, nature is overturned, water is blood, cattle dies, crops die. But most of all, the human spirit has forgotten how to function. It is, as Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, whose 50th yahrzeit we marked just a week and a half ago, taught, human beings are messengers who have forgotten the message. So when we look at the languages within our parsha and the incapacity of our bodies to do what bodies are supposed to do, which of course is all metaphoric anyway, what does it mean when your heart doesn't work the way it's supposed to? It means what the Kutzker Rebbe taught about the Shema. You might know in the Shema, it says, take these words, v'samtem al levavchem, place them on your heart. Comes the Kutzker, by the way, who dealt with severe mental illness, secluded himself in his own room and only burst out to shout at his students. We believe, though of course there was no diagnosis of this, that he was suffering from very significant depression with no treatments available. He said, and think about him being the one teaching this. It's in Heschel's book, by the way, Pursuit of Truth. Came out about the Kutzker and the Baal Shem Tov after Heschel died. He said, why does the text say, take these words, these deep lessons, and place them on your heart? Comes the Kutzker and says, because sometimes your heart's like this. And if I told you that in order for you to learn this stuff, you had to place it in your heart, which seems to be more sensible language, and your heart's like this, what happens when you try to let something in and you can't? It just bounces off and it would be lost. So the Kutzker says, that's why you take these words, this language of liberation, the stuff that reminds you how to breathe, and you place it above your heart, because every once in a while your heart will do this. If we're lucky, if we take good care of ourselves and each other, our hearts sometimes do this, and then the words will have a place to land. Now I know because I'm so blessed to be here once in a while, that there is a lot of life in this community. But we as a world have gone through so much of this, or so much of this, that it made our heart do this. And someone tells you it's going to be okay. Can you let that in? Or do we suffer from some kind of deep, extended trauma that has led us to be a little bit kotzer ruach ourselves? So touched by the real world that we all want to inhabit. That it's very hard to imagine that things will be different. And trust me, I'm so glad to be in this shul. I've been to other shuls. You should know how lucky you are. Other shuls are gorgeous too. But last night and right now, it's a little bit different. Deeper, harmonies, participatory, young and old. So when Moshe and Aaron bring this language, and Paro can't let it in, he says, I don't know God. That's like not knowing Joseph either. A willful denial that there's a history that is bigger than the self, where others are essential parts of my own life. Pharaoh doesn't live like that. And because of 400 years, the phrase, by the way, for the suffering that finally gets God's attention is called Sivlot Mitzrayim. The suffering of Egypt. A Hasidic commentator points out that it's because we have been enslaved for so long we got used to it. It's like the metaphor about the frog in boiling water. It doesn't start off boiling, and the frog doesn't go nowhere because it didn't notice what was happening. And we're not the only peoples who've become used to institutionalized injustice. But we are sensitized if we pay attention to what it is to not be able to even imagine that things could be better again. Even Moshe doesn't know that, which is why when Moses says to God, I just can't do it, God says, I'm going to give you a little bit more of me than I gave to your ancestors. Ushmi Adonai lo nodati lahem. They didn't know, your ancestors, Abraham and Sarah and the rest, did not know this name, which is odd because if you look at the book of Bereshit, yes, they do. That name of God appears many times in the book of Genesis. What does it mean that God says to Moshe, I'm going to give you this name which they didn't know? It means there's a part of me, this infinity, wherever Rachel is, she talked about this last night, the different tenses of God's four-letter name, was, is, will be. Those are all essential dimensions that cannot be limited, cannot be exhausted, and that's the power of being an image of God too. So I want to point out one last facet of this parsha, not because it's the last one worth pointing out, nor is it the actual way that the text is meant to be read. It's just what we do with it, one at a time, one generation at a time. All of this is meant to be a language of liberation that works subjectively and through that collectively. Our tribal journey of liberation is meant to bring us into service on behalf of any other who is oppressed and made to feel other. That's why it says so 36 times in the Torah, the most frequent mitzvah in the Torah. And the rabbis don't like it because when it says something more than once, it feels redundant and God doesn't waste words. So let's agree. It's not a waste. You need to hear it 36 times at least to know that it's actually your job. So tucked into this parsha is the practice that we do every Seder. 4 cups. And the 4 cups are related in this week's parsha to 4 languages of redemption. V'hotzeti, v'hitzalti, v'ga'alti, v'lakachti. 4 different ways of becoming free. God says to Moshe, tell the people, V'hotzeti, I'll take you out. V'hitzalti, I will save you. V'ga'alti, I will redeem you. V'lakachti, and I'll bring you to me. Think about dimensions of freedom when you can't breathe. Can you possibly go all the way to free? Can you go anywhere? So the first step is, I'll help you. V'hotzeti, I will support you leaving, breaking what is because it's not what you deserve. And in other words, using privilege when you have more of it than someone else. V'hitzalti, I'll save you. That's an inner truth. V'ga'alti, redemption is another way of saying you're worth it. V'lakachti, and I want to be with you. But I want to point out that those 4 languages of redemption are actually preempted. A Hasidic commentary points out that what leads those 4 into reality is essential to realize. The 4 languages wouldn't have worked at all had something not triggered it. The Abda Rebbe, an ancestor of Abraham Joshua Heschel, whose name was also Abraham Joshua Heschel, points out that Na'akat b'nei Israel, God heard the cries of Israel. That is the first language of redemption. What Pharaoh's heart would never allow, and what the people on a conscious level couldn't imagine, was still true within them, because why else would you groan when you're in pain? One of the strange things that's happened over the last 3 years is it's hard to read social cues when you can't see them. But I've been with people in person, masked, and heard something that didn't sound like just breathing. And I'm wondering sometimes if every once in a while, because we're still in it, even as we're trying to emerge from it, I don't even know which it I mean every time, and I don't really know what emerge means. I know trying, I know what that means. Every once in a while, I hear something that is deeper than breath, might even be a quiet groan. And when I'm not watching myself, I'm the one doing it too. I think that this process of healing that we are going to be engaged in for years and years and years is going to require the ordinary things feeling miraculous, like rods, not the serpents. Like gradual processes of redemption, because if we think we can get from here to there right now, we're going to be really disappointed and in more pain than we need to be. And I also believe that we have to give ourselves a chance to learn how to breathe again in every dimension, physically and metaphorically. Because it is really hard in our world to remember that we went through something, and therefore to remember that it's going to take a lot of gentle effort to get from here to there. So I don't want to end on the groan, but I do want to say that redemption began when we acknowledged unconsciously that this isn't how it's supposed to be, and we need healing. I think, quoting my friend, my teacher, that singing is going to prove really useful. It's a shock to hear someone else's voice still. It's really a shock to hear harmonies, which I hope we'll do when Musaf begins. But isn't it nice? Isn't it necessary? Those two dimensions, nice and necessary, are where I want to end for now. Nice, I would have said that 4 years ago. But once Zoom made it impossible to hear a harmony, it became more than nice. It became essential. The absence became present. So I want to bless you in the simplest of ways, that just like a rod, whatever helps you make your way forward, may it be miraculous and present. May our expectations of ourselves be small, and then small, and then small, because in aggregate, that's not so small. May we be gentle with each other, because sometimes our hearts are like this. And if we place all the wisdom we think we've accumulated and we expect it to pierce somebody else's heart, that's not fair. It doesn't work like that, not even when it's my own. So maybe we be gentle with each other, and may we learn to sing again. Shabbat Shalom.